and welcome to the HWS News Hour 2020 election special. My name is Ricky P. Rice, and I'm coming to you today from what can only be described as a mullet. Judy Woodruff, the unbiased, the breaker of lies, the jarl of journalistic integrity, the mother of the multifaceted interview, and the keeper of the public trust has the night off. In our program this evening, we are diving in depth into the 2020 elections with analysts looking at local, congressional, and the presidential race across the country to make sense of what happened in this election cycle. So without further ado, let's hear the analysis of HWS's Paul 303 campaigns and elections class.
Hi, Hannah. Can you tell us what happened in your local race?
So I followed Matt Slater. He was running for Yorktown Town Supervisor. He's affiliated with the Republican Party, but the position's pretty much nonpartisan. So for him, his biggest campaign strategy was just to interact with the locals. He was unopposed. So he was just kind of hanging out by himself within this political sphere. And he really focused on using Facebook and social media platforms, as well as just interacting on the like face-to-face, person-to-person level with Yorktown locals as well. And this proved to be really successful. So he is a Yorktown native, and our town is really big on just like being a townie or your family relations. The primary demographics of the town are from the Bronx, and particularly Irish and Italian descent. And this all stems from Yorktown being from like the white flight era, where these people moved out of the Bronx during its turnover phase in the 60s and 70s and started raising their families there. And now those children have grown up and are also raising their families there. So having that Yorktown bond really drew him in to just like the public's eye and what they like about him. On social media, he advertises himself as a family man. He posts a lot of him and his wife and him and his children, but he also posts just a lot about daily COVID updates, what's going on in the town, and he's made friends with the Yorktown Moms. It's a Facebook page, which is the hub of like all activity in Yorktown. Any news, any gossip, anything is found on Yorktown Moms. So he really used that to his advantage. He obviously won because he was the only person. But he provided Yorktown with kind of like a younger, fresher face in government, which is kind of something cool. Yorktown tends to have its governmental board be a ton of like older white men. He is a white man, but he's younger, so he's different. And he's looking to change Yorktown. His whole policy right now is to make Yorktown destination places, to invigorate businesses, to invest and redo our commerce buildings and our town center, but also make it a place where people from Lower Westchester or the city want to come and move or come in mini vacation or weekend.
That's great, Hannah. And why do you think you ran unopposed?
I just think that Yorktown town government isn't something that a ton of people are really involved in. Our town is a lot of older people and families, so the like people that could run are just older, so they're either just there to vote. They're all like friends with each other, the older crowd that's in politics. So that could have played into it. And then the people more his age with the younger kids are a lot of them commute in and out of the city or the tri-state area for jobs instead of doing like local politics. The average income for the area is over 100,000 annually, and I don't believe that his salary is that high. So that could have played into it, or just people being more focused on like the school board and stuff like that within our local politics instead.
That's great. And what happened at your state level race or your congressional race? How do you explain the outcome?
So I followed Yehuda Gottsfield. She ran for the New York District 17 House of Representative seat, which was previously held by Nita Lowey. She retired after 7 years in the seat. She was a Democrat. Yehudis is affiliated with the Conservative Party. She ran for the Republican Party, but she lost during the primaries to Maureen McArdle Schulman, and she is new to the whole politics scene. She was a chemical engineer and has her PhD in chemical engineering, but kind of transferred over to the politics world very, very recently. Her campaign strategy was kind of soft. She, prior to COVID, was doing a lot of like the face-to-face meet and greets, and she invested a lot of her funding in like yard signs or like mailer list for addresses or emails or phone numbers of people within the Republican Party or that are affiliated with the right, who generally go out to vote on a regular basis. This really didn't gain her a ton of traction because after COVID, she couldn't do a lot of the face-to-face meeting, and her social media was really inactive. She does go on Facebook and Twitter a little bit, but she doesn't check it as avidly as she should. She doesn't post as avidly as, in my opinion, she should. And just trying to find a balance between advertising to our geographic range within the district was really hard for her. For policy, she did try to align herself with the conservative Republican Party, but she kind of disaligned herself from mainstream Trump following policy, which for her was mainly just because she wasn't on the Republican ballot. So people couldn't vote across. They had to know her for either who she was, which she wasn't really getting her name out there as much as she probably could have. So her policy was her next biggest thing. Since she had the background in chemical engineering, she really tried to focus on the nuclear power plant within our area, Indian Point, and just focusing on getting support for nuclear power and different types of energy, especially since Indian Point is like supposed to close this year. And then she also looked into healthcare. She always talks about how she has family members who were like sickly growing up, and so healthcare, especially during COVID, and improving it with the massive amount of like medical facilities within our area, is something that really hits close to home for a lot of people. Our voter demographic too is similar to Yorktown, just on a greater scale. It's slightly more wealthy altogether. It's predominantly blue, where my local area is red. It's the smallest pocket of like red within District 17. And a lot of the people, again, are following like New York City politics within District 17. So for her, she really needed to focus on a subset of this demographic who would actually vote for her, especially since she wasn't, again, on the Republican Party ballot, so people couldn't just vote across and see her name. So she tried to direct it at like the elderly within the Republican Party who always go out to vote, and she put a lot of her resources towards getting them invigorated in the mail-in vote, since Republicans are kind of disillusioned with the mail-in vote, especially the elderly. And a lot of them would want to go out in public and vote in person, but due to COVID, that might have been limited. And then she also tried to go for the female vote and for the Jewish population within the area. Westchester is 9% identified as Jewish following and 51% female. So she tried to aim a lot of her like news articles and campaigns towards like radio stations and newspapers that followed either people of the Jewish faith predominantly or were like predominantly female ran.
That's great.
But she lost.
So I bet she lost.
She lost to Monterey Jones, who took over 50% of the vote. He was a Democrat. Again, the area is really blue, so like that wasn't really surprising. And then 40% of the vote went to the Republican, Maureen McArdle Schulman, probably just because people who were voting across just voted because she was more well-known in politics and she was just associated with the party that they were also associated with. And Yehudis really did not get her name out there as much as she could have.
And so, can you, when thinking about how these two races relate to the presidential race, what do you think are the three things that help explain why Biden beat Trump the way he did?
I really think that it was because of the blue wave of politics. In 2016, on an international scale, there was a huge shift towards the more like extreme or radical right, just because of how like economics and racial tensions were on a worldwide scale, and especially in the US. We were just coming out of economic recessions and just massive changes within the Obama administration, that when Trump came along, the middle class of America was really disillusioned with government and especially with the Democrats. And so he was able to hone in on their anger or just their angsty feelings towards voting and government in general by providing them with an entertainment source. He tapped into his entertainment background and kind of honed in on all of their emotions to get them united underneath his own policy, which was immigration and economic change, which was something that they could put the blame on the Obama administration for neglecting, which was causing their strife. Where now in 2020, the climate of politics is completely different. COVID-19 caused a huge economic crisis with mass unemployment. It also just caused a huge health crisis, over 200,000 people dying.
Hi, Jake. First, can you tell us who you were looking for in your local race?
Yeah. So I followed Kelly Burke. She is the incumbent mayor of Leesburg, Virginia, which is actually the town that I live in. And this is her second time running as mayor against Ron Campbell, who actually is in her who's actually in her cabinet, and he ran against her in 2018, I think it was, and lost, and ran against her again this year, and she actually blew him out again at 67. She got 67% of the vote this time around. And so basically, what she ran her campaign on was she was a big advocate for. She's a Democrat. She's a big advocate for pro-business in the area, which everyone in Leesburg, there's a lot of small businesses in the area. And when COVID hit, a lot of places were closed up, and she basically, what she did was, I'm going to be here for you guys. I'm going to help you guys in any way you want. And a lot of businesses around the area, you would go through the town and you would see her campaign signs up for all over the town, basically. And it kind of showed how the businesses were on her side. She has a pretty strong website that, she doesn't have a Twitter or a Facebook, so there's not a lot, she's kind of low in the media standards, but she's also a little bit older, so I don't know if that's like, she's not really trying to show that, but she she does a really good job of kind of just explaining. She's been in the town of Leesburg for over 30 years, and so she really is just trying to show that she's a resident of the town. She wants people to understand that, during COVID, that everything's going to be okay. And she kind of did a really good job of just getting her voters out there. And I mean, she had a dominating victory against Ron Campbell.
That's fascinating. And so what happened at your state level or congressional level races?
So yeah, this one is pretty interesting. I followed Lycia Andrews, she's was running against Jennifer Wexton, who was the incumbent of Virginia's 10th district, which is also kind of the same Leesburg area, which is kind of like, there's two main counties in Northern Virginia. It's Loudoun County and Fairfax County. And basically the majority of the state is red, but Loudoun County and Fairfax County are blue, and that's where a majority of the population is. And that's why you see Virginia has gone blue the last two election cycles, is because the majority of the people live in Loudoun County and Fairfax County. So Alicia Andrews is running. Basically, she has a pro-Trump rhetoric, and so she's a huge advocate for pro-life, pro-gun. She was making sure all the schools were going to be open in the area. She wanted her kids to go to school. Very evangelical. It wasn't I'm going to pull up the election results, but she got only 43% of the vote compared to Wexton, who got 56.2% of the vote. So, I mean, it was no shock to me that she lost. I've kind of been saying it all along. It's hard to beat an incumbent, especially when in Loudoun County and Fairfax County, where the majority of the people there are going to be blue. And I don't know, I feel like it was just, I think people were kind of seeing the same kind of, rhetoric that Trump used when on social media. She kind of posts the same similar stuff, always retweeting Trump and, kind of like attacking her competitor, Jennifer Wexton. And there was kind of like, you kind of saw a similarity between, Donald Trump and her by attacking their opponent and kind of attacking them at their character level. And I think people kind of saw right through that. And I feel like that kind of really hurt her in the election. And people just didn't, I mean, she got some votes, but I feel like everyone knew that Wexton was going to maintain control of that seat.
So that's fascinating. You've talked a lot about rhetoric and social media. And so I'm wondering if you see how you understand the relationship between the rhetoric on your local and state level campaigns and the rhetoric that we saw in the Biden and Trump campaigns.
So you're saying, sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, sorry. So you talked a lot in both of your analyses about the role of social media, and then certainly in the state or the congressional race, the rhetoric. So how do you understand the relationship between the rhetoric we saw at the presidential or general election campaign cycle? Did you see that reflected in the local and state races, or did you see it as opposition?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I saw a lot of, similarities, especially with Trump and Alicia Andrews. I feel like they kind of use the same tactics with, basically attacking their opponent and kind of, showing, the character side of things. And, I feel like people, like I said, people saw right through that. And I feel like it reflected on Alicia Andrews' campaign in a very negative way. And for Trump, I feel like, the media, I feel like kind of was, we always say that he controls the media. I feel like that kind of hurt him towards the end of the election. I think people were so kind of sick of, hearing him talking on Twitter. I mean, even now he's still kind of doing the Twitter thing with, saying like, oh, I won and stuff. I think people kind of are just like kind of sick of it. And I feel like the media in the end kind of was like the biggest downfall of his kind of loss here as president in 2020.
What was your local race, and who did you study?
Okay, so I did 2 elections at the state level instead of doing 1 local. So I'll focus on the race for House first. I focused on Jake Auchincloss. He was in the race for 4th conditional district seat in the House. Auchincloss is a Boston native who is a representative of the Democratic Party in the race against Julie Hall. Auchincloss is a former Marine, a Harvard graduate, and a former Newton city councilor, which Newton is just a town right outside of Boston. His goals were to make healthcare a right, not a reward of the status of your job, end the pollution that has been ruining our planet, and improve education systems. And he was clearly the Democratic candidate in the state of Massachusetts, which Massachusetts historically is a blue state. It's extremely liberal in that sense. And that my overall thesis essentially based around that. How even more so this election in 2020, it was all blue, which I thought had a trickle-down effect from Trump. So this is just my first candidate, Auchincloss, and he ran against Julie Hall, who was a Republican, and she was a former member of the Air Force. She was a really actually strong Republican candidate for Mass, being that she was a female. She has great leadership skills, and she had a lot of pros. She also didn't openly support Trump, but she didn't openly condemn him either, which I thought was a very strong point in Auchincloss, campaign, because his largest part of his campaign, specifically when he was asked why he was running for office, he specifically said to condemn Donald Trump. I have the direct quote right here. I apologize for the organization of my notes. So he said, Donald Trump's America is not the America I fought for as a Marine captain. It's not the America I've worked for as a city councilor. I'm running for Congress to help rebuild the country that sent my grandfather, a poor Jewish kid, to college during the darkest hours of World War II. Its institutions, its self-confidence, its commitment to justice. So that was his response to the media when they asked him why he was running for office. So clearly the theme of Donald Trump was largely he used that as a focal point to spur his campaign forward as a Democrat, essentially.
So then what was your, you had another congressional race that you also looked at, is that right?
Yeah, the race for the Senate. So that was Ed Markey.
Okay.
Who was the incumbent in the state of Massachusetts. He's been in that seat for 50 years now, versus my candidate, which I focused on specifically, was Kevin O'Connor. And Kevin O'Connor is a Republican in the state of Massachusetts. He actually, the interesting thing about him is going into the race, even when asked, when running in the blue state of Massachusetts, you would assume someone would condemn Donald Trump regardless of their affiliation, Republican or Democratic, but he actually ran on the basis of supporting Donald Trump and getting him reelected. So that was one thing with O'Connor that was a red flag right away, especially against Markey, who has been winning for years. O'Connor went to Trinity College and law school at Boston College. He has been appointed to the positions of the executive committee of the Boston Bar Association Council He co-chaired the BBA's Business Litigation Committee and was appointed a founding member of the BBA's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. He's a longstanding fellow of the Boston Bar Foundation and the 2020 co-chair of the BBF's John Adams Ball, the largest event for legal aid and funding in Massachusetts. One thing about O'Connor, which kind of separated him from other standard Republicans far right, is that he actually does believe in a healthcare system which can support everyone. So he does have a bit of that dynamic, which I think might have got him partially some of the vote. In the end, he ended up getting absolutely blown out by Markey. It was, I think it was around, I don't have the exact numbers here, but it was around, hold on, I do have the numbers. I just have it kind of jumbled because I prepared a different presentation, but it's, sorry. I think it was around like 65. I apologize. I can't find the direct numbers, but O'Connor essentially was blown out by Markey in that race. So
if you follow two Republicans in a really blue state, one of the threads we both
one Republican. Auchincloss was a former Republican, but he ran Democrat in this election. That was a huge red flag, actually.
Okay, why was that a red flag?
Because people thought he was somewhat of a fraud because of the, like, clearly, as Hannah already said, like the way that things are shifting in the United States right now compared to 2016, where things were shifting to the right, things are all shifting blue now, that's again what I did my research on, is how like Massachusetts aligned directly in voting all across the board was right around 60% Democrat to Republican.
Sure.
So
at the same time, one of the narratives that we've been talking about consistently, right, since the election, is that Trump had a much broader support, that the blue wave maybe didn't exist, right? So what I wanted to ask you, particularly with the Markey race, Trump made inroads in rural areas all over Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and the Rust Belt, and then certainly in Miami and around there. But did you see in Massachusetts any successful detachment that worked beyond the healthcare for your senatorial candidate? Was there any other distancing in which Republicans made grounds where Trump didn't, or where Trump made grounds where your Republican candidate didn't at the national level?
I mean, I think where O'Connor makes ground on maybe some people in Massachusetts is where Republicans do is with the tax plan, because I think Massachusetts overall is like it's a relatively more wealthy state, but it's also extremely liberal at the same time.
Don't you have a Republican governor?
Yes.
So how did he get elected?
Baker So Baker actually condemned Trump, but
So part of it, right, from your first one was that the distancing from Trump is what was working in the blue states.
Right.
So
Exactly.
did that come through and carry through throughout your research, that in the down ballot races, distancing yourself from Trump was successful? Or did you find something different in Massachusetts?
That's exactly what I found, is that the more closely associated you are with Trump, or even in Julie Hall's case, where she wasn't even directly associated with Trump, but even in the slightest, where she's from the same party and had similar ideals but didn't like fully support him, she was at a loss immediately. So in the blue state of Massachusetts, yeah, exactly.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for joining the HWS News Hour. What can you tell us about your local race today?
Yeah, so I was looking at Rob Consalvo, who was running for the 14th Suffolk County for the Mass House of Representatives. And one of his big things that I saw was school, just because he has 2 children in school. He was and is still the chief head of staff of the Boston Public Schools. And because this area is in a handful of the neighborhoods of Boston. And so that was one of his like big things. Aside from that, it was health, and then COVID-19 still is a big thing. And then just having spaces open for the public and keeping those spaces around. He was unopposed as a Democrat for this position, but I did look at the primaries because I thought that would be interesting to look at first to see maybe why he won. And from what I gathered, it seemed more that he was more well known. The other 2 people, one was an attorney, the other was in a few committees and unions, but Rob Consalvo he didn't win, but he did run for the mayoral election. He was, as I said, the chief head of staff and was in part of the Boston City Council. So he just was more well known, I think, compared to the other two. And then when I looked at the finances too of how much money he ran for that primary, he had a lot more. So I think that just kind of boosted him. And so that's why he won. And then he was unopposed, so therefore he won. I did look into gerrymandering just to see if that was even like a thing, but from what I gathered, didn't seem to have any realm in what I looked at.
That's fascinating. And so then what happened at your congressional level?
Yeah, so I also did the Markey O'Connor case, but I focused on Markey. And from what I gathered, the primary was more, he almost didn't win the primary compared to the general election. And it was just because Kennedy is such a well-known name and he had a lot of the youth vote. And from that, Markey was lagging. He also kind of got into the race late, but when he got the endorsement from AOC and back the Green New Deal, it really pulled in those young voters that he was so lagging behind. And so that's really what helped him win the primary. And then from that, now that he has that vote, the fact that he's very, very well known compared to O'Connor, that was a huge continuity I was seeing, is that he's just very well known over O'Connor. So that's going to give him a lead. And then, as was said, like, it is a very blue state. So that's kind of where and why he won by about 66%. And then also, just if you look again at the financials, because that was something I was seeing as a huge continuity, and that the people who won had more. Not that that's always the case, but it's a strong correlation. He had it was a very, very huge difference. The fact is Markey didn't even have to take out a loan, and O'Connor did. And even with that, it wasn't even comparable. So from those facts, I just think that's how he was able to continue to stay in.
Yeah, that's excellent. Very helpful. And so what elements from these two races did you see as reflected in the national race? Or did you see things from the national race that were reflected in these two races?
Yeah, so money. But I feel like that's not as big of a issue in the Trump versus Biden race, because I just feel like there were other factors that influenced it, but like Biden did have more. So that was that. I think with the state and federal being able to target a particular group and get that, though there were it was two different groups, with Markey going more towards the youth vote and then Biden going towards like the Black vote. There was still that push to get a certain group that would help them win. In terms of the local, there wasn't as much, I would say, just because it was a more odd election since he was running unopposed. So I would feel like there wasn't too much, but it was more, I would say the state and federal were closer with the fact that they were looking to target one group more so to get that. And it looked to see that it did help both of them.
Can you tell us a little bit about your local race and how you understand what took place over the last few months?
Yes. Okay. So San Francisco has really unique politics. And I think one of the overarching themes of this election is that the national political sphere of Trump dominated the conversation for all of the local politics, but I think it masked a whole bunch of little things that were happening within partisan politics on local and state levels. And I think this applies to all the races that I followed. So I think I followed the California District 11 state Senate race between Jackie Fielder, who's Democrat, and Scott Wiener, who's also Democrat. Scott Wiener is the incumbent, and he raised just around $1.5 million, a lot of money for a state Senate race, but not a lot of money in California. And about 75% of his funding came from real estate companies. And this is interesting because he's done a whole bunch of bills for them in the past, and his most famous bill was SB 50, This basically moved for a ton of policy to pay way for a ton of cash to go into building a ton of housing right beside mass transit lines. And this has benefited a ton of massive real estate in the state of California, which is like really the only thing California cares about right now. It makes a ton of money for us because we have really expensive and unequitable housing in the first place. Jackie Fielder is 25 years old, and I think there's a couple different things that happened in this race. Jackie lost. Let's give that context. But I think there's a couple different things that happened. We saw Scott distance himself from the Trump campaign so far and mask himself as this leftist, further socialist Democrat than what he is. In fact, within the San Francisco Democratic politics, he falls more in line with the Republican Party. But San Francisco, similar to Massachusetts and so many other spaces, is inherently this liberal bubble. We have, over the past couple decades or so, we've had massive gentrification and settling of elitism throughout the city. So there's a couple different things that I think happened here. One, Jackie Fielder raised just about $500,000, which is a pretty solid amount. She's 25 years old, she's queer, she's Latinx, she was graduated from Stanford like 3 years ago. She teaches, she's a lecturer, and she's founded the first public bank in San Francisco. And she's moved for a whole bunch of different things, from an indigenous wildfire task force, which was really impactful this year, to a lot of housing and safe injection sites here in the city of San Francisco. These are all massive things and policy moments that she has accomplished on a local basis. But what matters here and what mattered to voters this election was the distancing from Trump. So I think what we're going to see in the next couple of years of local politics is this really interesting unveiling of this facade of politics on the Democratic Party. I think we had this split. She did not win, but a ton of other Democratic Socialist endorsed candidates in San Francisco did, and she campaigned with them. And so I think local politics matters with your allegiance based on where you live geographically in the city, and it based on your demographics and the framing of each of the races.
And did you see these sorts of elements as well
in
your congressional race?
Yeah. So in Jamie Harrison's race, I think we saw a couple different things happening. He raised more money than we've ever seen before, but I think he had the same thing that happened to Beto. Beto raised 80 million, he raised 110 million. And I think we saw in both races, they won with a 40% margin. They lost, but they had 40%, which is pretty solid. I think two things happened. One, we see the old guard and incumbency playing a large role again in local politics, and student and voters sticking with the things that matter to them on the local basis. So I think when we look at South Carolina, they weren't ready for a split. We also know that he campaigned on a lot of different things that could come off as very socialist, and he raised way more money than Lindsey Graham, but the fact that Lindsey Graham was an incumbent, money didn't even matter. He raised literally so much money it should have mattered, but it did not at all. I think it mattered for the National Democratic Party, and I think that's what made it for Biden on a ton of levels, is that the Democratic Party could still pull and flex that much money.
So do you think in the Harrison race with the money, how much of it was a fact, how successful do you think Graham was in painting it as outsider money, which a lot of it was, obviously wasn't coming from South Carolina. But do you think that tapped into the sort of socialist line?
Yes, I think there's a yes and no. I think there's a couple different things. I don't know that Harrison spent his money the best ways that he could have. I think when we look at some of the races, Jackie Fielder had really successful social media, but she had it very directed. And I think there's a lot of pandering to the different communities that they identify with. I think Jamie Harrison had the opportunity to find a lot more common ground and collective space between Lindsey Graham's voters and his voters. I don't think he pulled as much from Lindsey Graham's voters that he could have. And I'll be honest, I don't think money helped him in that space, or that he used money to the best of his advantages in doing so. I think the same thing could go for Jackie Fielder and for Joe.
So you see a correlation like Allison was just talking about, that money is still the strongest indicator at the national, congressional, state level, or at local level in terms of who will win the race.
Yeah.
And so how do you interpret Biden's slight victory compared to his financial advantage? At what point does money matter, and what point doesn't it matter?
I think money matters on a national level. I don't think money matters as much on a state and local level.
Why is that?
I think that money means different things in a campaign, and the fact that people are able to cough up money in a national crisis for a national race like this, and they're able to cough up so much money, is unreal. But I don't think that we saw the benefits of that funding going down to local races. And I think when we look at the candidates, their boots on the ground, and you're seeing them campaigning, and then they're asking for money. What are they asking for? And that money just gets drained. And I think these elections overall pump so much money. This this entire year has just been ridiculously exorbitant, and I don't know that local residents can see where that's going, and it has no impact.
And so then why is it more effective in the general for the presidential?
I think it's impactful in the general because I think the nation sees that as a characterization of old guard politics, and I think that it does matter in that folks can see if this candidate is pulling nationally that much money, that means it means something to the rest of the country, and they're a part of a herd mentality. I think voters want to stick with someone that can make it happen.
Welcome to the News Hour. Can you tell us a little bit about your local races and how you explain what happened?
So my local race was for the state rep in the 114th district of Pennsylvania. I followed James May. He was a Republican. He was challenging the incumbent Bridget Kozarowski. James May is a veteran. He used to work for PennDOT, which is like the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation. He's a big Trump supporter, and that's kind of how he ran his campaign. He was way outfunded. He only raised $16,000. So he had a really interesting way to campaign. He would have Facebook Lives and different things like that. He also had, he would call them pizza parties. So I sent my assistant correspondent, my younger brother, to go to it. And he said, first of all, they charged him for the pizza and everything. And he also was the only person there. So it was clearly unsuccessful. Kozarowski was a former nurse. She was appointed, or she ran in 2019 a special election. What's interesting about this district is it's always run unopposed in all non-presidential election years by the Democrats. So the Democrats always run unopposed. So it's pretty heavily Democrat. So for the Democrat, Bridget Kozarowski, she was always going to be pretty safe unless there was a huge Trump wave, which did not happen in that area. Actually, it was the opposite. The area pushed back against Trump, and therefore May was incredibly unsuccessful.
And so beyond charging your little brother for the peace party, which is a great piece of information, are there other elements you think that keeps this local race from being competitive? But why, similar to the first presentation, why is it just the demographics that make this unopposed?
Yeah, I think it's
internal fissures in the Democratic Party.
Yeah,
do you know anything about that?
It's a pretty white, highly educated area, and it's using those demographics. I think it's going to always lean kind of Democrat, and having us that incumbent. So being that incumbent in a local state election, that's huge. I don't think anybody really knew who James May was. Yeah. And so if the Democrats keep passing it down to one another, they're always going to have that advantage.
Great. And how about in your congressional race?
For my congressional race, I looked at the Pennsylvania 8th district, which was between Matt Cartwright and Jim Bognet. Matt Cartwright was the Democrat incumbent that I followed. He's been the incumbent since 2012. But actually in 2018, it got interesting because this area redistricted because of the new Pennsylvania gerrymandering laws. This swung it a lot more Republican, especially looking at the 2016 Trump versus Clinton demographics. But in 2018, the first time he ever had a run in that new district, he ran against John Trinh, who's actually an anti-Trump Republican. And this did not go well for Trinh. He struggled, and Cartwright was easily reelected. This seat in 2020 was seen kind of gettable by the Republicans. They put Jim Bognet, who was a former Trump administration, they put him out there. They dumped a lot of money into him. And they thought if they can get a pro-Trump candidate in this area, that he could be successful. However, Cartwright still has the incumbent. He's seen as this moderate Democrat. He has a pretty high popularity in the area, coming from the fact that he was born there and he stayed there his whole entire life. Well, Bognet, on the other hand, was born there and kind of simply moved out and worked out other jobs around the country before coming back to run for this race. For Bognet, he ran a pretty interesting campaign against Cartwright. What I saw the big flaws in his campaign was last week when we talked to the guest speaker, he said when you have a new candidate running against an incumbent, the biggest thing is name recognition. But for Bognet, none of his ads were ever pretty an introductory ad. They were all just simply attack ads. He attacked Cartwright over the fact that he has a private jet, that he has a vacation home, and all these things. And also there was a pretty big, I guess a moderate controversy because in one of Cartwright's online Zoom town halls, he was asked about the idea of police defunding, and he brought up his record that he's on the House Budget Commission or committee, and that when they get that budget, that they need to look at where exactly where the money is going. So he wouldn't be opposed to what he said in his own words was that reshaping the funding. And Bognet went right after that and said that Cartwright said absolutely he wants to defund the police, and that kind of made like statewide news as like fact checkers deemed that incredibly false. And yet Bognet still pushed out ads and stuff that said that he said that he wanted to defund the police.
You're giving us a lot of great information on a few different valences that we haven't talked about with the other reporters today. The one thing that's come up in your local race, and it seems what you're talking about is this idea of the relationship between character and message. You're talking about May being a veteran, and then what you were just talking about with name recognition and incumbency, and a lot of that being built on character. So how big of a factor do you think character and messaging mattered in the presidential election compared to how it seems to have been a big part of what you are bringing to the table in terms of your local and congressional?
Yeah, I think that was really important this year. I looked at, for when I was doing my research for the general election, I was looking at exit polls between 2020 and 2016. And what was really interesting was in 2016, Trump won the exit polls that said they were voting at a disapproval of the other candidate, while in 2020, Biden completely dominated that area. So I think Biden's just overall likability more than Hillary played a huge role in this general election.
Yeah. Just start by telling us a little about your local races, what was interesting there, and what led to the outcome in your analysis.
Sure. So I followed the Portland, Oregon mayoral race, which was a really interesting one. It was Sarah Iannarone versus Ted Wheeler. Ted Wheeler is the incumbent. Portland, Oregon is a traditionally very liberal place, and that definitely was seen in both the candidates. Ted Wheeler was a Republican until about 2001, switched over. He's now a registered Democrat. Iannarone is very left. She has described herself as part of Antifa, which was an interesting part of this race, definitely rhetorically a little challenging for her as it went on. She's a self-proclaimed urban planner. She has kids who went through the Portland public school system. And she's worked in some local government, but definitely doesn't describe herself as a politician. And then Ted Wheeler is kind of this traditional, he is from a timber family and has lots of money, super white guy. Cool, he's very quirky. He fits the aesthetic, they both do, of being from Portland. And yeah, so he's definitely on the more moderate side. One of the things that was interesting about this race is they ran against each other in 2016, and Sarah Iannarone just super tanked. There was no chance. She didn't even get past the primaries. It was kind of a disaster. But then in this race in 2020, she obviously pushed through past the primaries into the general election. She out fundraised Ted Wheeler significantly, which was a really interesting turn of event. That being said, she lost anyways, but by a much smaller margin. So she got about 22% of the vote in the primary, and that upped to about the mid 40s in the general election. So it definitely wasn't a complete washout. Her rhetoric is, again, very left. There were some character challenges for her. She had a really interesting political pamphlet that went out that said that she had her PhD, but in a little parentheses, without her dissertation, so she doesn't really have her PhD, and some people found that to be really misleading. Obviously, she doesn't have her PhD yet. And then obviously the stuff about Antifa and, publicly being anti-fascist, especially with all of the Black Lives Matter protests that were occurring in Portland during this time. Lots of police violence and protesting. So it did get some national coverage as well.
Well, and her opponent, who ended up winning,
yes,
right, was taken to task by President Trump, right?
Yeah.
He became a sort of somebody to make fun of. And so who did you look at in your congressional race?
Yeah, so I looked at Sarah Gideon and Susan Collins. That race had incredible national coverage, which actually proved to be really detrimental in the long run. So to Sarah Gideon, she lost. But that being said, so Sarah Gideon, she is currently serving as a Speaker of the House for the Maine House of Representatives. She's a pretty well-known politician. She's from Freeport, which is where LL Bean is located. and she, has her kids. She's originally from Rhode Island, which Susan Collins took advantage of. But again, a pretty solid candidate. The, national wings of the Democratic Party really took her by the collar and kind of thrust her forward as this, the only possible Democratic candidate for this race that could ever exist, which is really interesting because 35% of registered voters in Maine are independents. We have an independent Congressman, Angus King. And so one of the things and the trends that I looked at a lot is the independent vote and how when there are all these polls, 538, everyone predicted that Gideon was going to win. It was maybe going to be a tight race, but especially with Maine's ranked choice voting, she had a significant advantage. And they predicted that the second the second district in Maine rather was also going to go blue, and it didn't. So we saw a huge divide down the ballot. And one of the things that I can kind of use as something that I found to kind of explain this is that people were voting for Susan Collins because at the very last minute, she pulled out a couple of her classic bipartisan moves. And so she kind of regained that stuff. And also in terms of the polling data, because there was so much money in this race, literally the Democrats spent over $50 million just on smear ads. 90% of the money in this race was out of state. And so when you're looking at polling, they heavily relied on quantitative data rather than qualitative. They weren't really talking to Mainers at all. So that was one thing that everyone was so fascinated on the money in the media that was being spent. The Portland Auburn media circuit saw about $89 million, and it's an incredibly cheap and small area. So everyone was just absolutely pounded with her advertising, particularly Gideon, because she did, again, significantly outraise Susan Collins.
Naomi, you've talked a lot about the independent vote today, and sort of that role. Do you see trends with what happened in Maine that happened nationally in terms of the independent vote and it being assumed to be Democratic? Or do you see something particular and peculiar happening in Maine that is anomalous to what's happening in the rest of the country that split its down ballot and presidential votes?
So I think we obviously did see a down ballot divide, and something that I think even I just didn't really factor into my previous analysis was the independent vote and how people are disassociating from the two-party system. Maine particularly has a high enrollment in terms of registered independents. We upped our voter registration significantly this election cycle, so there's more of them. And so that was something I think that people are really attracted to this idea of bipartisanship. And so we've lived in this polarized state that oftentimes, in reality, Biden is seen as a pretty moderate candidate. Realistically, Susan Collins has historically, since she was elected in 1996, been seen as a really bipartisan candidate. And so I think there's something really attractive, especially to those independent or more conservative Democrats, to vote for someone like Susan Collins. They've been voting for them their entire life. And so this is just another election for them.
And so thinking about that just a little bit further, was Gideon's primary, was that closed to Democrats only, or was it open?
It's an open primary.
Okay, so it's an open primary and they still picked someone that the independents didn't like.
Yeah, which is interesting because Lisa Savage also ran as an independent, but she just continued her campaign, and which Maine loves to do this and just split the vote. We've done it twice with our governor. We ended up with Paula Page, who's interesting, twice, because we just love to split votes. And so the independent vote is consistently a huge role in Maine's politics and continuously just gets ignored by the Democratic Party, always to their disadvantage. So hopefully they learn from their mistakes.
Thank you very much.